a todos. Bueno, es para mí un honor el moderar este panel. La verdad es que tenemos tres speakers que lo van a hacer en inglés. Las preguntas hacerlas indistintamente en inglés o en castellano, pero bueno, es interesante que luego tengamos una batería de preguntas para ellos. Just to introduce very briefly this session. Well, now we are going to deliver what is the vision of the Europe vision of this issue. I mean, it's something very relevant. Decarbonization is one of the key policies that are going to be applied in the next years in Europe. We have already started with that, and the European Union is in the forefront of the fight against the climate change. We have today three speakers with us that can provide us this European vision of what's the situation, what is the current status of this fight against the climate change, and basically to see how the transport is contributing to the reduction of the CO2 emissions. Well, for that purpose, we have three speakers. Jayson Dong. Jayson is project manager at AVERE. AVERE is the European Association for the development of the electric vehicles. So AEDIVE, in fact, is a member of AVERE. We have William Tots, that is Executive Director in Transport and Environment. That is an institution that promotes let's say, how the transport can contribute to the decarbonization of the economy. And we have Clara da Torre, who is Deputy Director General in DG CLIMA. Is one of the DGs of the European Commission. So I think that not all of you have presentations. You have presentation, so you can start. Yes. You would?
Okay. Just want to thank AEDIVE for inviting me, for Arturo especially for thinking of AVERE to come and to present what we're doing at the European level. So thank you very much. I will get into my presentation. So just a bit about us. We are, yes, the European Association for Electromobility. Our members are essentially the national associations across Europe, such as AEDIVE, but our membership is varied. We represent, from our perspective, the entire e-mobility sector, from industry associations to EV users, as well as academia. And apart from a strong e-mobility kind of industry, we also believe in clean, healthy cities and independence of fossil fuels, obviously. So I will start. We also have a very, we currently map, I would say, registrations and EV numbers from across Europe through our EAFO portal. So it's a project we're in with DG Move in the European Commission. So just looking at where we are right now in Europe in terms of BEV penetration and PHEV penetration, this is generally where we are in 2019. Here you can really see the top 5 registrations across Europe. Obviously, you see Germany, France, Netherlands. It doesn't include Norway specifically because they're not in the EU. This is where we are in Spain. Obviously, it's a bit not in line with where we are with other countries, but we see that it's moving here. It's definitely a developing market that's growing quite quickly, and we look forward to, working more in this sector with AEDIVE. And just the general charging infrastructure as well across Europe and in Spain as well. So generally when I show this next slide is really where we are in terms of market barriers for EVs. This is kind of where we were yesterday in terms of high purchase costs, limited charging range, limited charging infrastructure. But what we see now, it's not limited anymore. It's the perceived limited driving range, the perceived limited charging infrastructure. Predominantly, in any case, we're seeing that people charge mostly at home anyway, so it's not that we need to have charging points you know, every kilometer from here to Norway. It just needs to be strategically placed. And that's still this communication efforts that we see a bit lacking across Europe, is that from east to west, we will have the charging infrastructure in place that will be rolled out, and I will get to that sooner. We have the amount of cars that are coming as well. The purchase cost is coming down, and we can drive predominantly wherever we want to nowadays. With the cars now that are coming onto the market, these barriers are really not the major ones we see anymore in Europe. I also like to show this slide from Lessons from Norway. This is really interesting because you see that they have not actually changed their legislation towards promoting EVs since 2006. Everything has stayed in place for the past around 10 years, 10, 15 years now. And they're now considering actually to roll back the amount of subsidies and incentives for electric cars. We have our Norwegian member, the Norwegian EV Association, there, and they work quite tirelessly to promote this and to ensure that this kind of incentive stays. That they're now trying to make sure it stays until 2021 because they have their own very ambitious targets. But what I do like to mention is that what they do have troubles are currently, and what we're seeing across Europe, is the charging in apartment buildings. We all know that in Europe, there's many people who live in apartment buildings, not always new ones. It could be old and existing ones. And from our perspective at AVERE, what we've seen from our members all across Europe, from east to west, from north to south, is that in existing apartment buildings, it's still the case that it's very difficult to charge your electric car, to go through the process to get an electric car. So they've really accomplished some major aspects, they've achieved some accomplishments in the past couple of years. Residents in apartment buildings in Norway cannot be denied charging without a valid reason, and they're trying to ensure all new buildings will be charging ready for the future. And they've also created a national support scheme for making existing apartment buildings charging ready. So just to show that the issue of charging is not just something that you may find in Spain, in Belgium, in Eastern Europe. The Norwegians are also dealing with it as well, and they're really pushing the government in this regard. This is also something that I find is very important still to this day. 67% of people have influenced their social circle to buy an electric car. Still, it is important how much you as a person talk to people, how much you talk about it within your friends and your family. It's very important still, this informal spreading of knowledge about buying an electric car, and it does actually influence people. So it's actually really important. This is something where we see for the future. It's not scientifically kind of analyzed. It was something done by Jori van Mierlo, our Vice President at AVERE. It's really just to show that if we want to get 100% passenger car EV fleet by 2050, the amount of time, the amount of ramp up that will be necessary within the time from 2035 up until 2050 will be very, well, let's say it will be a bit of an ambitious effort, but we believe it's possible to get there. The benefits from CO2 reductions, the less dependency on oil imports are there, and we need to take advantage of it now, and we believe we can reach this. We believe we can reach it because we have trends in shorter charging times. From our perspective, we don't just think about charging now, fast charging at 50 kilowatt hours. That needs to be changed. Well, we see now 150 kilowatt hour charging now on the markets, 300 coming as well. We see this as a major, this will impact the markets, and we see that's, you will be able to charge 100 along the long corridors and along rural areas, so it will play a major role in increasing the uptake and allowing us to achieve these ambitious goals. ICE bans, you have to go and you have to look up almost every time you want to go to a city, not only in Europe but in the US, whether you can go with your petrol car, so it's just much easier to drive with your electric car in the cities. then you don't have to look up the regulations. So this is going to be definitely a driving factor. We see cities playing a huge role in the decarbonization and the transition to sustainable transport. Battery technology, we see these graphs all the time about how quickly battery technology is coming down, the price of the battery, it's coming down quickly. This will obviously play a role in, and we see it already playing a role in helping us reach 100% electrification by 2050. The future as well, I'm not sure how many car manufacturers I've seen have this kind of these letters within their kind of strategy for the future. We use CASE, I think BMW used something else, but it is about connected, autonomous, shared and electric cars. This is the future where we're going. It's not about car ownership per se, but car sharing and the way you kind of changing that mentality of the future and the future of driving. We see that also playing a huge role in the future of e-mobility. And this is also something, the bottom part is, was a study done by a French member in AVERE France, showing that the mass amount of electric cars will not have such a huge impact on the grids. It's really only represents 10% of French consumption. It won't exceed, let's say, 48 terawatt hours. But the caveat here is that we do it smartly. We do it with timing our charging so that we don't impact the grid and we don't all come home from work at 7 o'clock and charge our vehicles at the same time. This will allow us to flatten out peaks in the energy sector. We will be okay, though. It's in the end, the fear-mongering, let's say, we've heard from some players in the markets, it's not going to be that intense. We just have to do it properly. This top part as well, this is the Amsterdam Arena. This is just to show what you can do with the second life of an electric car. So once, 10, 15, 20 years when your first car battery, when the EV battery expires, you can use it for your second life. You can power it in your home. And this is actually what we're trialing right now. It's a project we're involved in with AVERE, is to showcase the power and the abilities of second life batteries. They recently were able to, with storage capacities from the EV batteries in Amsterdam, power a Champions League game for the entire night going off the grid. So the future is now. This discussion about when we get there with e-mobility, no, we're here right now, and we can do these kinds of business cases now, and everything is essentially not thinking about the future, but thinking about how we do it now. With EV growth, what I really want to show with this is that we'll also have the electric cars, as I was saying. I think we're going to, by 2021, we'll have massive amounts of electric cars, not just from the expensive Porsche e-Taycan, but actual cars that the normal people, the average consumer, will be able to purchase for a relatively normal price that will increase, what will benefit the average consumer essentially will be able to purchase. At EU level, what we're seeing, it's not just that, the consumers will go there, the manufacturers are willingly pushing out the electric cars. It's also because they have to. Now with the CO2 wide emission limits, they're going to have to, starting from next year. They have to actually meet the limits that were decided upon last year, the 15% in 2025 and the 37.5% by 2030. This is really, across the board, we're really seeing car manufacturers having to change business models to reach these targets. But they also have to, because we're seeing CO2 emissions rise from last year. And this is still an impetus to really continue with the markets, that we're still seeing CO2 emissions rise. In raw materials and recycling, just to touch on as well briefly about what we're going to need these raw materials, and we're still going to need a lot of cobalt from the Congo. That's a fact. But we can keep these raw materials in Europe by investing in recycling, lithium-ion recycling, Second Life again, and the EU is now focusing on this with a huge batteries package that will come out as of next year to incentivize recycling, to improve and to improve the industry here, to invest more in keeping all the raw materials in Europe so that we continue to keep up our competitiveness vis-a-vis China, Asia, and the US. And lastly, as well, the EU is looking right now at the alternative fuels infrastructure directive, which is primarily going to push out charging infrastructure. So while we do have to play catch up, we believe that we will be okay in the coming years. The Commission will come with this, the market will respond. We're not worried about charging infrastructure because we know the market will catch up in this regard. So we believe that the target's ambitious, but in conclusion, we just have to take the opportunities. Not playing is also very risky. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayson. William, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is William Dotz. I lead transport and environment. I'm extremely pleased to be here. I come to Madrid very often. My brother lives here. My wife studied here. She worked here. So it's always nice to be here. What I will do in the next 10 minutes or so is I will speak first about the European perspective, and I will then briefly talk about some work we've done on Spain. Because we are a European organization, we have an office in Brussels where people work on cars, on trucks, on gas, on oil, on aviation and shipping, but we also have national offices and national members. We have about 60 members across the European Union, and we have offices in Berlin, in Rome, in Warsaw, and of course in Madrid, and my colleague Isabel is here right in front. Maybe you know Isabel, and if you don't, you should really get to know her. She's great. So, I think I have slides. Yes, I do. Let's see how this works. Yeah. This is why we exist. Over the last 20, 30 years, transport, including aviation and shipping, has overtaken the power sector and big industry as the single biggest source of emissions in Europe. So if we talk about decarbonizing our economy, if we talk about a 2050 perspective, as Teresa Ribera did just now, and as the Commission representative will do after me, then this is the big beast we need to tame. We need to completely decarbonize the transport sector. And as was said by Jayson Dong, that is extremely difficult because actually over the last 30 years, emissions have been going up, and that was also the case in the last couple of years. So I don't need to tell you in this room, it's an e-mobility conference after all, that the solution to the transport emissions problem is to phase out the use of oil. Because ultimately, all of these transport emissions come from the combustion of oil. Gas and other stuff is really marginal. It's all about petroleum. Now, there's a number of ways we can reduce oil consumption in the transport sector, but the single most effective way and the most conclusive way to move away from oil is to electrify the transport system. Again, I don't think I need to explain that to you. Now, if we are talking about electrifying the transport sector, where are we today? These are figures from 2018, so they're a bit outdated. We were at around 2% then. I think we're about 3% today, 3% EU average. As you can see, the growth in sales, in EV sales, is concentrated in a number of markets. And I think what you're seeing in Europe today is that you have a limited amount of vehicles that are produced by car makers, because car makers are not trying to produce as many EVs as they can and try to sell as many EVs as they can. They're producing a limited amount of these vehicles, and they're selling them in the markets where the tax systems are most attractive. So we are looking at a very constrained market today. At the same time, you've all been reading the papers, you've all seen that something is going to change, and something is going to change very radically in the next 2 years. And what is going to change is that for the first time in, well, at least in the last 10 years, we're going to see car makers, including Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, even Peugeot and Fiat, starting to sell plug-in vehicles and actively try to sell these vehicles. And they're doing that for a number of reasons. First, because the technology is much more mature than it was a couple of years ago. Second, because if they want to be competitive in the global market, they need to be competitive in China. And China is aggressively going towards electrification. Third, if you're a premium car maker, Tesla is no longer something you can joke about. Actually, Tesla is now selling tens of thousands and actually getting close to 100,000, I think, vehicles in Europe. So that means, that means that car makers need to move. But the single most important reason why they will be moving in the next year is the European CO2 standards. In 2008, that's a long time ago, the EU adopted CO2 standards for car makers. What these CO2 standards say is by 2020, you need to reduce your average emissions of all the vehicles you sell to 95 grams. Complying with these standards does not require you to go electric. You can do it in different ways. Some car makers, such as Toyota, will comply mainly with hybrids. You have different choices. But what we're seeing is that most car makers are probably going to comply with a lot of plug-in vehicles. And plug-in vehicles, for me, that means both full electric, hydrogen, and plug-in hybrids. And we're expecting a mix of mostly plug-in hybrids and full EVs. The reason we expect this to happen is we have had a look at the production plans of OEMs. This is based on IHS data. And IHS is well-known consultancy, and what their numbers show is that going from 2018, you've got a really stark increase between 2018 and 2021, and that can only be explained by the CO2 standards. And so, as of, if you're looking to buy an electric car, I think 2020 and 2021 are going to be good years. Ironically, the reason car makers have to sell that many plug-in vehicles to comply with the CO2 standards, because this was not expected. I was around when the CO2 standards were adopted. We were not expecting car makers to sell a lot of EVs, because we were expecting them to comply through more efficient petrol vehicles, more efficient diesel vehicles, through hybridization, mild or full. We weren't expecting any of this. But what happened is that whilst we were expecting them to improve the performance of their vehicles, actually the performance of the vehicles decreased. So the CO2 emissions of new vehicles has actually risen slightly over the last years, and that can be explained mainly by the rise of SUVs. Between 2008 and today, the number of SUVs and crossovers that is being sold in the European market has increased exponentially. And I think, that is one of the reasons why plug-in vehicles are going to play such a big role in the 2020 and 21 compliance. Now, the good news is that along this EV production boom, we are finally seeing the establishment of a battery supply chain in Europe. And so there's a number of companies that are setting up in Europe. Some of those companies are Asian companies, LG, Samsung, CATL, big CATL plant being built in Germany. But some of these companies are also European. I think it is important to remind ourselves that the battery supply chain is not just producing the cells. It is battery materials production, it is recycling, it is lots of things. And in the battery supply chain, European companies do actually have a role to play. There's Umicore, which is a big European company. There's BASF. And I visited Northvolt last week. They're based in Sweden. So it's a European company that is backed by European money. And they're going to be producing lots and lots of European batteries. And they're going to take care of both of the materials for the batteries and the cell making and the recycling. So this is an example that, as Jayson said, the race is not over. This is going to be a huge market for the foreseeable future. And I'd like to draw the parallel between what happened to internal combustion engines. The race for internal combustion engines was not over when Ford started mass producing in the United States. There have been a lot of ups and downs since then, and I think Europe has managed to find its way in that market as well. And I think we can do the same here. Now, what is really important is that if we shift towards electromobility, that we do this in a sustainable manner. I'm not one of those people that believes that EVs are not better than combustion engines. They are better. It's clear that even with today's electricity production, an average electric vehicle compared to an average diesel or petrol vehicle is better. But we are not looking for better. We're not looking for 30% better, we're looking for 100% better. That's our objective. And if that is our objective, we need to take care also of take care of the entire supply chain. That means that we need to have responsible ethical mining, be it in Europe or outside Europe, mostly outside Europe for now. We need sustainable battery production. That means that if you're producing cells, you need to be using clean electricity. The energy used during the production of the battery, of the battery manufacturing process is absolutely essential to the carbon footprint of the electric vehicle throughout its lifetime. And then, of course, smart charging, battery second life, and recycling. We did a study which we published a while ago, which showed that there's almost no recycling of car batteries happening in Europe. Most of these batteries are being exported to China and Korea, where you actually have big recycling companies paying good money to get access to the cells. We don't have that market in Europe today, and if we want to, have access to the jobs, to the added value, the big recycling industry will create in the future, we need to create a legal framework for that, and I think that's what the Commission is intending to do. But we should always, we should encourage them to move fast. And of course, as Teresa Ribera said, it is not just about changing the engine of the vehicle. We need to move to a mobility system that is much more efficient overall. It is clear to me, and I hope it's clear to everyone in this room, that the future of mobility cannot be 2.5, 3-ton vehicles driven by one person. I think we're looking for something a bit more intelligent. And I think the combination of electrification with digitization offers the opportunity to make our system a bit more efficient. Now, I've talked about cars until now, but we should also talk about trucks. We often tend to forget about these big vehicles because we don't drive them ourselves, but they are actually responsible for about a quarter of fuel use in the road transport sector. That means a quarter of emissions, and that is Europe. Globally, trucks are responsible for almost half of the fuel use in the road transport sector. So if you're looking to decarbonize the transport sector, you really cannot afford to ignore heavy-duty vehicles. The good news is that electrifying part of the heavy-duty sector is already possible today. The technology, the battery technology that we have today allows us to electrify urban delivery vehicles, not just really small 7.5-ton vehicles. We can actually go up to 16, 22 tons. We can do that today. This is a matter of forcing OEMs to actually go in that direction. But the big beast we're trying to tackle is, of course, long haul, because that's where most of the fuel use is. If you would have asked me 5 years ago when I was heading the heavy-duty program of Transport and Environment whether electrification of trucking was possible, I would have told you, just like everybody else, oh no, that's never going to be possible. Actually, today I think that is no longer true. I think the development of battery technology and the development of battery prices allows you to imagine long-haul electric trucking. There is an issue, there's a challenge with recharging these vehicles, but that challenge is surmountable. There's also alternatives to battery electric trucking. There's the e-highway system that's basically running trucks on highways like we run trams in cities. It is actually an economically viable solution. And we have a third option, and that is hydrogen. That means we have 3 decent competing options to electrify our shift to zero emission long-haul duty trucks. And I think that's going to be absolutely essential, because if we only electrify the car segment, that is not going to be enough. So what's next? Because we're at the beginning, at European level, we're at the beginning of a new cycle. We have a new Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She has appointed Frans Timmermans, a Dutch socialist, to lead what she calls a Green Deal for Europe. There's a lot of high-level ambition and optimism about what we can achieve on climate in Brussels at the moment, and that is, I think, largely related to the fact that there has been so much mobilization on climate in a number of European countries in the past years. The question is, what are we going to do? There's discussion about increasing the overall targets. That is not something that concerns me directly. What I'm really interested in is what measures, what actions are we, is the Commission going to take to accelerate the electrification of our transport system? And I think there's a number of things we need to do. And I think that sort of the heading is, we need to move the car manufacturing sector, the truck manufacturing sector, beyond the compliance logic. Because what car makers are currently doing today is they are complying with a regulation. So they're going to be selling as many EVs as they have to sell to meet the CO2 standards. And then they will do more or less the same thing in 2025. We need to go beyond that logic. This needs to become something that is market-driven. And there's reason for hope, because the prices are coming down. But I think we need to be really, really clear to car makers that there is, in the longer term, no future for combustion engines, and that their investment and effort should go towards zero emission. So there's a number of things we need to do. We need to strengthen the CO2 standards. We need to continue having the discussion about phasing out combustion engine vehicles at local, at national, and also at European level, because there's a discussion as to whether you can actually do this as a country. I think the Commission should take a view on this and should create a framework that allows member states to phase out combustion vehicles if they want to do that. We need a massive rollout of charging infrastructure. It is, as Jayson said, we can be optimistic about the ability of the market to deliver parts of the solutions needed, but it is also clear that Europe is a big continent and that the market is going to focus where the initial EV market is going to be biggest. We need to create a system where Europeans can drive across the continent and charge their EV, whether they're if they're going from Belgium to France or from Spain to France, and even if they're going to Eastern Europe, to places where EVs are not as big, not very big today. Then I think we need to look beyond supply-side only policies. There's a number of policies that we are really interested in. Those are related to fleets, taxis, buses, but also rental car fleets, company car fleets. These fleets are operated in a different way than private car fleets. They're based on the TCO perspective. From a TCO point of view, electric cars are really attractive. So I think this is where we can go a lot faster. I think, personally, I don't think in the next 2 years, our job is to convince people that buy 10,000 euro cars to go electric. I think our job is to focus on the fleets and people that are a bit more upmarket and that are focused a bit more on TCO. Voila, and then green battery supply chain that I mentioned already. Okay, so that's the EU part, and now I'm going to quickly say something about Spain. And the main thing I want to say is that we have, as Transport and Environment, analyzed here the Spanish NECP, which is one of the better NECPs. But I think one conclusion we drew from this analysis is that the ambition to go to a fleet of millions of electric vehicles in Spain by 2030, that there is no way that we can achieve this, that you can achieve this with the current tax system. The current tax system is not fit for purpose if that is your objective. And so we have commissioned a study which was finalized, I think, yesterday night, so that we could show some of the conclusions here. We have copies with us, so if you have additional questions on this, please contact Isabel. But the key conclusions of this study are that if we want to accelerate the electrification of the car fleet in Spain, there's a number of things we need to do. And those are related to, in particular, the registration tax. The registration tax is one of the key drivers for people's choice of vehicle. It is also a very fair way to use taxation. You're addressing people that actually have a choice. And you're also addressing a group of people that has the money to buy a new vehicle. So you're not addressing people in the countryside that drive second-hand cars. I think that's a big added value. There's a lot we can do with company cars. There's a number of other tax reforms we can take. But all of these will ultimately be needed to achieve the ambitious goals set in the NECP. And then the study also looks at a number of additional measures related to the creation of low emission zones, the creation of zero emission zones in the future, vehicle labeling, and parking policies. So we'll be happy to share that study with you once it is published. We'll also accompany it with a policy briefing, and I look forward to discussing it with you and with Isabel. So many thanks for your attention. I hope I didn't exceed my time too radically. Many thanks.
Thank you, Willem. Well, before going to the next presentation, let me just remember you that you have to use your APP in order to put the question for the debate at the end. Clara, please.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Muchísimas gracias a CEVE por invitarnos a este congreso. La movilidad sostenible, conectada, asequible es un tema que está muy cercano a mi corazón y a mi profesión, y estoy encantada de estar aquí. I will now, if you allow me, switch to English, so that's not to be too different from my two previous speakers. I'm sure we all know that 1 year ago the Commission issued what we call a long-term strategy vision on how Europe can become the first, how Europe can become the climate neutral continent by 2050. Doesn't mean totally decarbonized, unfortunately, but it's net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And this, as we all know in this room, requires a profound transformation of our economic system, our energy system, but certainly of our transport system. And as we all know by now, the new Commission President-elect, Mrs. von der Leyen, has said that she wants that Europe becomes the first climate neutral continent. So she said she's proposed that she will be launching a new Green Deal in her first 100 days of office. And this will have different components: zero pollution, farm to fork, biodiversity, but especially let me draw your attention to the climate law, where she has said that she would like to she will propose to enshrine in law the climate neutrality for 2050. And she has also said that she is going to propose reinforcement of targets of CO2 emissions for 2030. And she has charged Vice President Timmermans, as our previous speaker has reminded us, to make all this happen. We know here that transport is the key sector if we want to meet this decarbonization, this climate neutrality targets. And because we know that unfortunately this is a sector which is still growing in CO2 emissions since 1990. And the analytical work that we've done precisely to prepare this long-term strategy for 2050 shows that we need to reduce CO2 emissions in transport by 90% in 2050 compared to 1990. And this shows that business as usual doesn't work, and we need to do something which is totally different. What can we do from a policy perspective? Starting with the Minister and the following speakers, we've heard a number of them. Let me remind what we have in place and what we will have to have. The CO2 standards, so well known to this audience, for the cars, for the vans, for the heavy duties, are instrumental to reduce CO2 emissions. We've seen very telling charts before in this stage. And not only these standards will contribute to reducing the CO2 emissions, but they will contribute to enhance the European automotive industry competitiveness. And it will help to, it will give benefits as well for the consumers, if only in terms of reduced cost of operations, including the fuel costs. So, but now that we have the legislation for 2030, it is crucial to enforce it. And we see that manufacturers are bringing to the market, as you know, an increasing number of zero-emission or low-emission vehicles, and these are clear game changers that we have to embed in our system. You know that this legislation for 2030 is going to be to undergo an extensive review by the end of 2022 for the heavy-duty vehicles, and for 2023 for cars and vans. So we are starting already thinking on what we have to do by those dates. And we will be reviewing a number of issues, and the targets themselves, but also the degree of deployment of all these vehicles. And we are thinking of including as well other vehicles such as the buses, the medium lorries, and the trailers. As I was saying, our President-elect has said that we have to reinforce ambition for 2030 as of now. And we have to look also at other instruments beyond the CO2 regulations. And this is, for example, the ETS, the trading system, which is a very important complement to the CO2 regulations. And we are also going to undertake a review of the Energy Taxation Directive. Also, I'm sure you've seen that our President-elect said that we need to launch a new strategy, a comprehensive system approach strategy for smart mobility. As we all know here, and hear that repeatedly, but it's never too much, we are not talking about vehicles anymore, we are talking about the mobility of the citizens and mobility of the freight. So all this transformation has to take place without leaving anyone behind. So we have to have a number of supporting measures to this regulatory framework to accompany this transformation. The deployment of infrastructure, which is a crucial element, and the batteries value chain that we've been hearing about. Let me spend a few minutes on each of them. On the infrastructure, if we don't have infrastructure, we forget the alternative fuels. We need to have more charging points for the cars, and from around 140,000, 145,000 that we have today, we will need to have around 1 million in 2025. And it is also because of that we are going to review the legislation on alternative fuels infrastructures very soon. These instruments, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructures Directive, has been assessed, and we are going to make, the assessment is being finalized, and the interlinkage between precisely this directive and the national plans is of the essence. I hope that this legislation on the cars, on the infrastructure, on the overall mobility plans, on the taxation, gives the right signals to investors of the direction of travel we have to undertake, and we have undertaken. And I'm sure that we will all gain by aligning, better interlinking the EU policies with the national policies that are about to be completed, let us say, in view of the current legislation, because as you know, all the countries, and the previous speaker has referred to the Spanish program, have submitted preliminary national plans for climate and energy, and the final ones, for the time being, will be produced by the end of the year. And we hope to see there more about infrastructure change, infrastructure deployment, interoperability of the charging points, facilitation of the way in we bill when we are charging a car. These are all a number of issues that can discourage very much the deployment of these cars in the market. For all these things, or for many of these things, we need money. And we need private and we need public money. and the EU budget can help as a leverage for this to happen. We all know in this room the so-called Connecting Europe facility. We all know in this room the cohesion and policy, the cohesion funds. We all know that if all these different sources of funding do not find a coherent framework, we are going to be wasting part of the resources, the public resources, and we are not going to lever the necessary private investment. So I'm sure that the wisdom of all those that have a say in this will impose. So much for the infrastructure. We all agree we need it, we need to invest, and we need to have incentives for this infrastructure to be used. The batteries. We know that unfortunately, currently the batteries are produced, most of them, outside Europe. And the Commission has a determined intention to contribute to developing a European value chain for the batteries, for batteries to be manufactured in Europe. And we need, as previous speakers said, a sustainable value chain. You know that 2 years ago, Vice President Šefčovič launched the so-called Battery Alliance, and we launched then the batteries, strategic action plan for batteries with different building blocks. We had a research and technology building block, but we have a manufacturing building block, we had a recycling building block, and all these have to come together. And I will not forget, of course, all the work that has been done, as in my previous job, and is being done, with the funding from research and innovation from the Horizon Europe program. We see positive developments as the investments that have been already mentioned. There are preparations of what is called the important projects of common European interest. You know, these are huge projects, conglomerate of projects, where public and private funding is put together and which has a special treatment under the competition aid framework, where the intensity of public aid can be higher if a number of circumstances are met, namely innovation and European interest. And at this moment, as we speak, some of these projects have already been submitted for the Commission, notified to the Commission, and they are being examined. The implications for industry, this room is full of those that know very well what that means. And just to remind ourselves, and we should be reminding the citizens in general, is that becoming climate neutral is not a burden. Becoming climate neutral is also a business opportunity for Europe and for the European industry. We are seeing a large deployment of, an important deployment of hybrid cars as a transition technology. And it is projected that at least 80% of the new e-car fleet in 2030 will contain still an internal combustion engine, if things are as they are now. We are always reminded, and we keep that, we try to keep that in our legislation. We try to remain technology neutral. And it is up to the industry to see where this compliance, more compliance. I tend to agree with my previous speaker that certainly we have to comply with legislation, but we have to try to go beyond that. And the choices are very big, and please don't think any of the avenues that are on the table are closed, as some pretend they are. And the digitalization of our mobility systems do have also an important part to play in their efficiency and thereafter in the path to climate neutrality. The citizens' perspective is crucial because they buy the cars, they use the cars, and all levels of governance have to be involved in taking these important decisions, from the organizations representing consumers and passengers to local, regional, national, European authorities have to be involved and have to take, each of us, our own responsibilities. Under this commission, there has been, under the mandate of this commission, a lot has been done already, but we will have to continue and reinforce and make a step forward. And step forward, 1 minute, I'm out. Step forward means as well what some like to say, I disagree with that, but I say it, the soft part, which is the climate pact that our president-elect has announced. And there, everyone has to be part of it so that we have a number of pledges that materialize in actions that help us in reaching the objectives by somewhat changing our behavior. Contamos con el apoyo de todos ustedes para que los objetivos europeos que compartimos sean una realidad. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Clara. Well, we have 5 minutes for at least 2 or 3 questions. Thanks to the audience, because you have put several questions, but I will choose those more popular. Well, there is a question that I think that I can address this question to any of you. Do you think that car manufacturers will be able to reach the future CO2 targets through hyper-efficient petrol or diesel engines, or the new energies are the only option?
So, from our perspective, we really see that it will have to be either electric, plug-in hybrids when it comes to passenger cars, as William was saying as well, that it's going to have to be in that area, and we see them investing in that area. He was showing some graphs to that nature as well. No, it cannot be diesel anymore. Also, the appetite. When you talk to people on the ground, when you hear the situation in member states, that the appetite for diesel is just not there anymore. That the local kind of importers of cars and the dealerships as well are not able to actually push out diesels anymore, and you really need to now focus on going fully electric, and in some cases maybe plug-in hybrids. But yeah, that's from our perspective.
So I think the 2020-21 targets, if you would want to, as a car maker, you could meet those through ultra-efficient petrol, diesel, and a bit of hybrids. You could do that, but I think if you go back to the slides that I showed, if you look at the market developments over the last years, it's a bit late for them to now all of a sudden completely shift their combustion engine fleet towards hyper-efficient petrol cars. I think they've made a choice. And in that sense, policymakers are always insisting that they are technology neutral. Of course, the industry is not technology neutral. They're looking at, they can't spend 10 billion on hydrogen, 10 billion on hybrids, and 10 billion on electric. So they're making a choice, and the choice they're making is towards plug-in vehicles, both plug-in hybrids and EVs. And for 2025 and 2030, I think you will need a degree of those types of vehicles to comply.
Thank you. Well, there is another question regarding batteries. Clara has explained us the policies that the European Commission is applying in order to, let's say, to contribute to the promotion of the technology of batteries. But there is a question asking regarding the manufacturing of batteries. What else could we do in order to bring to Europe factories producing batteries?
I'll briefly say something because it was a question to you. Sorry, no, you go first. Sorry. No, sorry. No, sorry. Apologies. I was actually at Northvolt in Stockholm last week, and this is a really excellent example of how Europe, through the Battery Alliance, has actually created a battery manufacturing plant out of nothing. There was an idea. There were two guys that worked for Tesla that said, "Why are we not producing batteries in Europe?" They went to Europe. They said, oh, we actually have lots of cheap renewable electricity in the north of Sweden. Oh, that would be, we could put that to great use. Actually, there's going to be lots of demand for batteries. And actually, LG, Samsung, and all the other guys, they also have to set up shop in Europe, because we are not going to be importing gigawatts of batteries from China. That's too risky a supply chain. So batteries will be produced in Europe. The only question is whether they will be produced entirely, partially by European companies. So I think a strong supply side pull on the car makers, so that there's demand, and then supportive measures, investment from the EIB, et cetera, that is actually making the difference today. Yeah.
No, that I can subscribe all these words. We have, it is clear that we are not going to bring back what is being produced in Asia. So the first thing that we all know is that we have to develop a new generation of batteries. And this new generation of batteries needs a lot of investment, but this needs first a lot of knowledge. So in Europe, we are supporting the development of new materials, new management systems for the batteries, so that the whole battery is produced in Europe. We start with the cells and we go until the final. And it's very important that the OEMs are part of this deal. And this is why in some of the projects that you know, that we all know, bringing in as one of the partners, full partners for establishing this value chain, bringing in the OEMs is of the essence. Otherwise, the purchasing, the supply contracts that they have with Asia would be, and I hope it's not true, but it will be prolonged, and then we'll never finish with this story. Also, we have to make sure that when we deploy our batteries, we have a number of sustainability criteria that are embedded, that we are using recyclable, we are doing batteries recyclable by design. Where are the raw materials coming from? We cannot just be fighting against those countries that do not protect the human rights and at the same time taking raw materials from there. So there is a whole complex set of material and immaterial assets that we have to make sure. But I am also convinced that this will be, I mean, there are signs that show that investment, public and private, is popping up, and the knowledge is in Europe, and we have to succeed. We will succeed.
Jayson, something to add?
Yeah, just I could say briefly that I echo what the other speakers were saying. It's really about the strategic partnerships as well that will need and will be key to ramp up this competition, again, with the OEMs as well, because they're the ones purchasing the materials. If you think about it as well with raw materials, we have that capacity in Europe. In Spain, as the representative from Infinity Lithium was saying yesterday, that there is projects in Spain that are currently looking into the lithium, production and of the raw materials here as well. So if we can bring that to Europe, and then as well in that second hand, the recycling, prove the economies of scale when it comes to lithium-ion recycling, that whole aspect of it, it's really a system approach. You look at it, will really help with European increasing of competition with manufacturing of batteries.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but time is over, and I have received a message that we have to finish. So thank you very much.